All right, let's start again. Hello and welcome to the Mid-Atlantic Arts Folk Traditional Arts Community Projects Informational Webinar. My name is Joel Chapman. I'm the Program Associate for Folk and Traditional Arts at Mid-Atlantic Arts. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a white man with blonde hair and a vintage Rock and Roll Hall of Fame crew neck shirt on. I'm speaking to you today from Baltimore, Maryland. It's a nice gray winter evening. We've got about an hour and a half of sunlight left, but it seems like it's already setting. Um, this is the traditional ancestral lands of the Piscataway, the Susquehannock nations. So we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future. And just because land acknowledgement doesn't really do a whole lot to right the wrongs of the past, I'm also going to share a link to the Heartbeat Music Project. It provides music education to K through 12. Let's see, I don't think it's sent. Trying to send it in the chat. Oh, because I'm dumb. Um, because it's the Heartbeat Music Project and it provides music education to K through 12 students on the Navajo Reservation. So if you feel like you can, consider making even just a $5 donation. If not, I get that too. Keep it in mind for next time you feel like you have cash to do so. My colleague Ellie Dassler is also here today. She'll be monitoring the question and answer and helping with any technical difficulties. Ellie, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Ellie Dassler. As you can see from this incredibly flattering photo of Joel and I on the screen right now, I'm the program director for Folk and Traditional Arts at Mid-Atlantic. My pronouns are she and her. And if you're listening, I'm a young white woman with short, straight, dark hair and bangs, wearing a green sweater and glasses. I am joining today from Richmond, Virginia, which is the unceded traditional lands of the Powhatan peoples, including the Rappahannock, Pamunkey, Chickahominy, and Mattaponi tribes. Thank you all for being here.
Great. Thanks, Ellie. We'll have a question and answer, as I alluded to, period, at the end of today's webinar. So we'll answer all of your burning deep folk and arts grants questions then. If you want to ask a question, just type it into the question and answer box. Assess through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, at the bottom of this window. We'll work down the list and try to answer all the questions at the end. Go to the next. Um, As far as requesting accommodations, guidelines for this grant are available at midatlanticarts.org in PDF format and an accessible Word file. And that's pretty much what we're going to be going over in essence and through this webinar. So if you need any kind of accommodation, to read these or get these, please send them to me at send a request to me at any point during your application process. And there's my number and my email. So please feel free to call me for any accessibility needs or anything else, as we'll discuss later. Any accommodations, please send at least 2 weeks prior to the application deadline. So let's see, what are we getting into today? Here's a bit of an agenda so you can plan your bathroom breaks accordingly. Let's talk about Mid-Atlantic Arts. Before we get into it, um, for anybody who might not know much about us, Mid-Atlantic Arts is one of 6 regional arts organizations here in the United States. And our member states and territories include Delaware, District of Columbia, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Virginia, and West Virginia. You can see our mission here on this next slide. And just to give you some idea of who we are within the National Arts Service Organization ecosystem, you have local arts agencies on the county or city level. You have state arts agencies. I know many of you on the call have worked for them or do work for them now. And then you have regional arts organizations such as ourselves. And then the National Endowment for the Arts at the federal top level. So, Mid-Atlantic Arts historically has distinguished itself amongst the other regional arts organizations through its work in international cultural exchange, performing arts touring, its knowledge and presence in the jazz field, and of course, its support of folk and traditional arts. So, let's get to the protein. What are folk and traditional arts? This program specifically funds folk and traditional arts projects. So let's start there. What are they? As the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, explains, folk arts are elements of culture that community members may share, such as common ethnic heritage, cultural morals, language, religion, occupation, or geographic region. These vital and constantly reinvigorated artistic traditions are shaped by values and standards of excellence that are passed from generation to generation, most often within family and community, through demonstration, conversation, and practice. Folk and traditional arts include craft, material culture, foodways, dance, music, storytelling, and so much more. We think of folk and traditional arts as the creative practices that are based in and reflective of the knowledge, practices, and creativity of cultural communities. And they encompass everyday art and aesthetics that are often part of a greater community-based context. So, what do I mean by this? Some folks may look at here at this basket and just see a basket, which would certainly be an example of folklore by itself. But if we look deeper at the cultural context of this object, we know it's specifically a white oak basket from the Cub Run locality of south central Kentucky, maybe. We might learn additional knowledge like what it's made from, white oak, how to make it, who made it, where it's from, and in what context somebody would use it. Also, the role it plays in people's identity. These are all dimensions of what we call folklore. Folklorists have been wrestling with this definition for over 130 years, and I think that's actually to the strength of it. Like folklore itself, it remains an unexhaustive and flexible term to look at the homegrown art forms that are used for expression, communication, and so much more. But if you want to talk more about the good old Anglo-Saxon compound, call me up sometime. Let's move on to the grant. What are folk and traditional arts community projects grants? So, Mid-Atlantic Arts, Folk and Traditional Arts Community Projects grants fund projects designed to support the vitality of traditional arts and cultural communities in the Mid-Atlantic region. For this particular program, nonprofit organizations, units of government, or federally recognized tribal governments in the Mid-Atlantic region can apply for funding in amounts from $1,000 to $7,000 to engage folk and traditional artists, practitioners, or culture bearers in community-based projects. Eligible projects include, but are not limited to, performances, public art collaborations, workshops, trainings, exhibitions, field work or documentation, and creation of traditional artwork. Projects must include some publicly accessible component. This could be a performance, event, exhibit, video podcast, question and answer session, public interest meeting, archival collection, website, or report. You get the idea. If you have something outside these realms, call me. We'll talk about it. And in alignment with Mid-Atlantic Arts' strategic vision to promote equity, diversity, inclusion, and access, applications for projects that support or engage underserved or underrepresented artists, practitioners, traditions, or constituents are strongly encouraged. Let's look at the requirements. Your organization must be located in all the states I mentioned, but let's go through them again. I'll go through it faster this time. Delaware, D.C., Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Virginia, West Virginia, and native nations that share this geography. Your organization must also be a 501c3 nonprofit, a unit of state or local government, or a federally recognized tribe, as I said earlier. Units of state or local government must provide a document on official letterhead to confirm status as government entity. And unfortunately, fiscal sponsorship is not permitted for this program. Your organization must also be in good standing with Mid-Atlantic Arts with no overdue or outstanding required reports or other grant documents. What are some limitations to this grant? So, we only fund specific direct costs of the project, and no grant funds may be used for indirect costs. You will list your direct costs in the budget section of the application, which may include artist fees, program staff salary, marketing and promotional expenses, supplies and equipment, rental or purchases, printing, publishing costs, artist or cultural worker travel, lodging expenses, and expenses related to public health measures for in-person engagements. An additional note on supply, equipment purchases, or rental. Equipment paid for by this grant must be specific to your proposed project. For example, renting stage and sound equipment for a performance. After the grant period, supplies and equipment may be retained, provided they will be used for activities similar to those of the funded project. But you can't use community projects grant funds to purchase equipment for your organization's general operating needs. Please contact us with any more questions about eligible expenses. It's also important to know that grants must be matched on a one-to-one basis. So this means that you must have additional funding for your project from a different source that's at least equal to the amount of your grant request, what you're getting from us. This may include grants from state or local agency, private donations, ticket sales. Um, you will need to identify your anticipated source for this match in the project budget in your application. We say anticipated because you don't need to have it in hand now. You just need to have it in hand when we sign the grant. The match for this project may not include federal funds, and the grant and the required match may not be used to match other federal funds, whether they received directly from a federal agency or indirectly, such as through a state agency or other entity. That can kind of get a little muddy. So, again, please call us if you have questions, or we can go over it again in the question and answer. Let's move on to the application process. So to start, you will need to log into your Smart Simple account. And if you've never submitted a grant to Mid-Atlantic Arts, you'll need to create an account first. The address is down there kind of tiny in the pink font, midatlanticarts.smartsimple.com. And I'll put it in the chat here. The application will require information in these fields. So just to go over them, the required application materials will be your applicant information, which you'll set up with your account in Smart Simple, your project details and narrative, your project budget, your work samples. I think that's it. Oh, nice. Panelists will review work samples. Panelist review of work samples is limited to no more than 20 minutes per application, so be selective in what you choose to submit. We highly recommend limiting your selections to 3 to 4 substantive work samples relevant to the project. Okay, I see that no links are coming up. We'll get those in there eventually, before the end of this webinar. You can submit audio, video, image, or document work samples. Video and audio must be submitted via URL, and image and document can be uploaded directly. For audio and video samples, please submit no more than 3 per application. Individual samples should not exceed 5 minutes. If a clip exceeds 5 minutes, make sure to indicate which 5-minute portion reviewers should be paying attention to. For image work samples, please submit no more than 5 images per application. For document work samples, please submit no more than 3 documents per application. Review criteria. The criteria will look very similar to the last cycle for those of you who might have applied this past spring. These correspond directly to the questions you'll see in the application. One is traditional art form. The project's featured traditional art form is important and relevant to the community engages. Two, project personnel. The staff and the featured artist are experienced and appropriate for the project, as defined by their community, audience, outside recognition, or some combination of the three. Three, community collaboration. The project centers collaboration with community and featured artists, including by project design, execution, and evaluation. Four, diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. The project serves and reaches artists and communities whose opportunities to experience the arts are limited by geography, race, ethnicity, economics, or disability. Five, accessibility. This project considers and defines a clear plan for accessibility accommodations during when the project will be happening. Six, evaluation. There's a clear plan for defining and measuring the success of the project. And seven, project budget. Project includes evidence of direct, fair compensation to artists, practitioners, and our cultural workers. Um, a diverse group of folk and traditional arts specialists, including folklorists, cultural workers, artists, practitioners, and cultural bearers, will serve as panelists and provide program feedback informed by their role in application review. We'll share more about what happens to your application after you submit in the very near future. So here's some tips. First step is to give the guidelines a careful read over at least once, but as many times as you feel you need. Um, it's kind of dry, so I understand not wanting to read it more than once. But what you really need to focus on is your responses and to make sure they accurately describe both the project itself and the tradition, community, art form that it's connected with. You cannot assume the panelists will know you or be familiar with your community, region, or art form. I always tell folks, pretend as if the panelists are from Mars. The panel does, it does consist of a diverse group of folk and traditional artists, specialists. So they will get it if you describe it, but they can't be expected to know every instance of folkloric culture in the Mid-Atlantic region. If you think you're done, I encourage you to make sure you check your answers directly against the criteria review. You might have the most in need, vibrant, important tradition, but if your answers don't stack up against the criteria, the panelists won't be able to give you a good score. The review criteria listed in the program guidelines are used by the panelists to evaluate your application and score it. So the better your application meets the application review criteria, which we went over and is in the guidelines document, the more likely it is that your application will be funded. There are no bad grant writers, maybe just bad grant application editors. So make sure to give yourself enough time to edit and imagine scoring it as related to the grant criteria. And lastly, work samples. Make them count. This is really kind of the bread and butter. This is what the panelists will be able to visualize your project with. This can make an application stand out to a reviewer. Work samples are crucial and are considered carefully during the panelist review. They should demonstrate quality of the artistic content and/or technical ability as applicable. They should be recent, concise, high quality, and relevant to the project. After submission, so it's March 11th, you've just submitted the greatest grant application of all time, blowing our socks straight off. What happens next? First, Mid-Atlantic Arts staff review your application for eligibility concerns. Then the applications, including work samples, are sent to panelists to evaluate applications against those program criteria we mentioned earlier. Bzzz. Fast forward 6 weeks, We get together with our lovely panelists, we talk about a handful of applications, and they have the chance to rescore. Then we take those grant recommendations and we send them to our board of directors for approval. Notifications go out to panelists 2 months following the deadline. If you're awarded, if accepted, the money will be paid out before the grant period stated in your application. Final reports will be due 30 days after your last funded activity. So before we finish up here and head to some questions, I already see some in the chat. Here are some important dates you'll want to keep to short-term memory. Applications are due March 10th. Award notifications will come June 20th. Project period July 1st, 2025 to June 30th, 2026. So we really appreciate you all being here today. What questions can we answer for you? Direct them my way, and then I'll have Ellie answer them. I'm just playing. I can help too. You can type questions in the Q&A feature of the Zoom. And we have about over 30 minutes here. So we might not use all that time, but we can if you need. We're here for you. So while folks are typing questions, I just want to also plug our Mid-Atlantic Arts newsletter, which you can find on midatlanticarts.org. If you aren't receiving emails from us already, when you sign up for the newsletter, you'll receive targeted emails for grant opportunities and reminders about upcoming program deadlines. We don't automatically add you to our mailing list for signing up for this webinar, so please make sure to sign up if you'd like to receive updates. When you visit the website, midatlanticarts.org, please just click in the upper center where it says sign up for newsletter. All right.
All right, I put our contact information up here on the screen and I can put it back up at the end. It's also on the website, but I am going to stop sharing while we do Q&A because it's a lot easier for me to see the questions. All right, see lots of questions. All right, the first question I see says, can these projects be performance-based or part of an event? The answer to both of those questions is yes. Performances are an eligible type of activity. We funded lots of performances in the past. You can see a full list of the kinds of projects you can apply for on the guidelines, but performances is part of it. And they may be part of a larger event. You could apply, for example, to fund one artist who's part of a festival or one component of a larger community event. You should just focus on in your application emphasizing what it is that this grant would bring to that event that you maybe wouldn't be able to accomplish without this grant funding. And if you have specific questions about what project you're thinking of, and you want to brainstorm with Joel and I, please reach out for like a one-on-one conversation.
Next question says, is there a requirement that we include a folklorist if we're planning an event? No. No folklorist required. We also have pretty loose definitions of that. Most of you probably are folklorists in my book, but you don't need to be. So hope that answers.
Yeah, that community collaboration question is really that's who you should involve in the event. The community that you're working to, that's going to be your audience and the artists. So you don't have to have someone who calls themselves a folklorist be part of that, but just the fact that you're thinking collaboratively with the people who the event is for, that's really what's important. Next question I see says, what can we use for matching funds? That's a great question. Can really be a variety of things as long as they're not coming from a federal source. So some examples that Joel mentioned and that are in the guidelines include like a grant from a local arts council or a state arts council that use, state or city funds instead of federal funds. It could be private donations from private individuals who want to support your organization and its work. It could be ticket sales if you're charging admission for your event or for other events. It could just be an investment from your organization if you have money that you're already committing as part of your annual budget to go towards the event. So yeah, really a variety of things. It's just that they can't use federal funds. And that's because this program, Folk and Traditional Arts Community Projects Grants, is funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, and you can't match federal funds with other federal funds. But in terms of where that source can actually come from, there's options. And again, if you have a question about whether the funds you're thinking of using for a match actually qualify, please just ask us. Next, I see one that says, can work samples be a video that has small clips from various events or performances? Yeah, like a highlight reel, sort of. Absolutely. That sounds like that would be a great work sample. Next, I see for the match requirement, can salary be used as a match? Program staff salary. So the money that's paying for staff directly working on the program can be used as a match. That would be like an investment from your organization. But general operating funds, no. The match has to be funding specific to this project, as opposed to just general funding that your organization would be using to run in its day-to-day. It has to be project-specific funding.
Thank you for your compliments on the presentation. Yes, there will be a copy available online on our website and on our YouTube that we'll post this week or next week, I'm sure. So look for it on the same place that we have the guidelines and everything else for this grant program.
I got another match question. That makes sense. The match can be pretty confusing. Can matching funds be from another Mid-Atlantic Arts grant or another non-federal grant? So it depends. Generally speaking, you cannot match Mid-Atlantic Arts funding with other Mid-Atlantic Arts funding. And again, that's because of that you can't match federal with federal, and a lot of our programs are funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, so we can't use them to match themselves. You'll notice that in the guidelines for this program, it says that you can't receive both this and like a Mid-Atlantic Tours grant with the same artist in the same year. And that's because if you did, that project funding would bump up against each other and would violate federal match requirements. So generally speaking, no, your match would need to come from somewhere else. Other non-federal grants though, yes, as long as it's not federally funded. Like I said, a state arts grant, a grant from a private foundation or from your local arts council, those would all be fair game for the match requirement.
Office hours, we do have some, and I'll put them in the chat, which is now going to everyone. I swear. Everyone. Wednesdays, 1 to 2. This will start January 22nd, and we'll go right up until March 5th before the grant is due, with maybe a few dates missing in there. But they're all listed in the chat. You can see it online. And the Zoom link is on our website as well.
Will you fund a virtual project? And if so, do all the participants in the virtual event need to come from the Mid-Atlantic region, or is it enough that your organization is in the region? That's a great question. Virtual projects are eligible. You should still make sure that you're meeting all those requirements, like community collaboration, that you're involving the community in the planning of your virtual event, and that you have a plan for the evaluation of the virtual project, that you have plans to make it accessible, all that stuff. But as long as you are meeting all the other grant requirements, virtual projects are eligible. The participants don't all need to be in the Mid-Atlantic Arts region. That would probably be pretty hard to control if it was a virtual event. So just the organization that's applying, your organization has to be based in one of our states or jurisdictions in order to be eligible to apply. But your participants can come from all over. And that is even true of in-person events. You can, of course, welcome participants and artists from outside the region. It's just that your applying organization has to be based in our region. Okay, we have someone says I go to so many grant sessions and this one was a blast. Thank you. See, Joel, you're very entertaining. I have
We
a
got to make
question.
grants more fun. Come on.
Somebody's got to. This first, Erica says I have a question about applying for a regional folklore archival project. What would be appropriate to send in terms of a work sample for this application? That's a great question because the work samples that you send in are really going to be personalized to the kind of project that you're applying for. So for an archival project, some good kinds of work samples would be if your organization has done archival work before, an example of like a catalog of what that archival work looks like. Information about who the personnel that you're bringing on board are, like a resume or an example of a past project that the person has done. And also because that public requirement is part of it, it has to have a public facing component. So work samples related to what your public facing component would be. So like if you plan to do a podcast using, recordings from your archives, for example, you could include an example of, and your organization has done podcast work in before, you could include an example of that, or an example of a recording from the archive, or other pieces of, information from the archive. It could be a plan for an exhibit that you're planning that will be based on archival pieces. It really could depend, but I would say something that will show my organization is equipped to manage this archival project and do it respectfully and do it well. And this is our plan for how to satisfy our public facing component. And again, if you want to have a longer conversation about that and really dig into the nitty gritty, come to our office hours or just shoot Joel or me an email or give us a call.
Another related work sample question that was in the chat and not in the question and answer was, can you give us examples of work samples? And I think we could. Yeah, we won't here. But if you want to have a one-on-one with us, we could definitely find some work samples that we're allowed to share. Does that sound reasonable, Ellie?
Yeah, we would have to ask permission from past people
Yeah.
who've applied. But there is a list of example types of work samples, like based on the project at the end of the guidelines. So if you go to the end of the guidelines, you'll see a list and it's like, for a performance, submit, and then it lists different, an example of the artist's work, and it breaks it down for different kinds of projects. So I would say check there and then follow up with us and we'll try to get you what you need. Someone asked to put the email information in the chat, so I don't know if you want to do that. And I will put the slide back up again at the end, so y'all can see it. It's also available on our website. Marianne asks, does this have to be a new project or can it be part of our regular program offerings? It can be part of your regular, so like a recurring project that your organization does every year. It can be part of that, but like I said before, you should explain in your application why this grant program would sort of enhance or diversify or strengthen that program in a way that wouldn't exist without the grant funding. But it can be for a recurring project or something that you have done before. Is it okay if the total project cost exceeds the one-to-one match? Yes, that's just fine. As long as you fill that one-to-one match requirement, you could get, $5,000 from us, $5,000 from your local arts council, and $2,000 from ticket sales, for example, and that could be your full project budget. You don't need to tell us all of that in your application. You can, but really the priority for your application budget is just what this grant funding would be spent on and what the match would be spent on. Like think back to that example on our slide, the same example is in the guidelines of your total project budget being $14,000 if you were requesting a $7,000 grant and you had $7,000 of match. But it's not a big deal if your project budget is bigger than that. In fact, for a lot of kinds of projects, it would have to be, if you're putting on a festival, $14,000 is a pretty tight budget depending on the size of the festival. So, it definitely might be more. You just don't need to have that confirmed in your application, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and in the budget form, you actually can't report more than the
Oh,
$14,000. It won't
there
let
you
you
go.
submit. This is a thing that many people have trouble with. It's kind of confusing. So, but there is a place at the bottom, a field called budget notes where you can, list, additional information about the larger budget if you feel like you want the panelists to know about that. Um, but in the application, you only need to report about the seven you're asking from us and the seven that you're using as a match or whatever you're asking for, 5 and 5, 2.5 and 5, whatever.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. I forgot that we had that issue with the budget form last year. And again, if you are filling out your application and you are having trouble with it, just give us a call.
I had a few people with that budget issue, in the 11th hour and had trouble submitting on time because of it. So just, make sure you get in there and fill that out and figure that out sooner rather than later.
Oh, this is a great question. If we are torn between applying for this grant or the CALT Experiences grant, the Central Appalachia Living Traditions Experiences grant, but can't make the webinar, can we schedule time with you all to talk further? Yes, please. So some of you may be familiar with the fact that we have another grant program that is also open right now called Central Appalachia Living Traditions Experiences. It is similar, but the eligibility requirements are very different. So some of you may be eligible for both if you are in an Appalachian county, but not everyone will be. So because these programs are similar and the difference between them can get confusing, we are having a webinar specifically about the difference between these two programs on January 15th at 3, and you can register for that on our website. If you go to the CALT Experiences page, we can get that link in the chat for that webpage. But you're also welcome to schedule a meeting with us to talk about it, more about for your specific situation, which grant program would be a better fit. That is a common question and a good question because they are similar programs.
We have some questions in the chat. I'm just going to intersperse as we go down through the Q&A
Go
ones
for
as
it.
well. Someone says, I have a festival that takes place in 3 cities. How should I list that? One event with 3 locations, etc. It kind of depends. I think if all 3 locations are within the Mid-Atlantic and you're using grant funds for all 3 of those, however way, then I would list them for sure. If you have maybe one in the Mid-Atlantic and two out, or some combination of one outside the Mid-Atlantic, you would only need to write about um, the one that is within the Mid-Atlantic region that you would plan to use the funds for, because you won't be using funds for any of the events outside of the Mid-Atlantic, if that makes sense. If you're only using it for one of 3 and they all are in the Mid-Atlantic region, then up to you if you want to go in depth about the entirety, of the project, or if you would just want to focus on what these grant funds will be funding. So that's kind of there will be space for it if you need to or want to describe it. You don't necessarily need to, depending on your grant project. I would email me and we can maybe talk about it more.
Generally speaking, think about the scope of what you would be funding with this particular, like with this grant money, if you were to get it. So that may be all 3 cities, or it may only be one, depending on what it is that you're doing. Someone asks, can we use in-kind matches? So not to satisfy your one-to-one match requirement. For the one-to-one match requirement, that has to be what we call a cash match, which means funding from another source, not an in-kind match like volunteer time. or donated supplies. It would have to be donated funding or other grant funding from another source. There is a place in the budget form where you can list anticipated in-kind matches, but that will not count towards your match requirement. And if you were to receive the grant in your final report form, you would have to explain how you were satisfying your match with cash, not with in-kind. Very good question.
We had a question in the chat. Are there any notable changes in requirements, process, or goals since previous cycles? And I would say since the last cycle, not really at all. In fact, I really don't think we changed that. It changed a lot the previous cycle from the second. So this is our, what is this? This is our fourth time doing this.
Yeah, in 2024 to 2025 was the big change, but
Between two and three, and now we're
yeah,
at four.
yeah.
So no,
If you applied last cycle, if
no.
you applied last spring, it's basically exactly the same. Can the project have multiple deliverables, such as different performances and music lessons? Yes, absolutely. Like if you were bringing an artist to your community for a weekend and they were going to perform and also give a workshop, for example, that would be great. You can have your project can absolutely have multiple components. Um,
Question in the chat: can our newsletter that has all of our programs for the year be used as a work sample? Yes, it can, but I would also make sure to have work samples that are specific to your event. I think it's a good example of having something that they gives the panelists an idea as yourselves as an organization that can kind of see like what your general workload is annually and the other kinds of programs that you exist. It can give them a better idea. But I wouldn't, I would make sure you also have some more specific examples to the project that, really zoom in. It's good to zoom out too, though.
would an artist in residence program that features traditional and folk artists be eligible for this program? Yes, absolutely. We have funded artist in residence programs through this program before, and they've been successful. So, yeah, that would absolutely be an eligible project.
Ellie, I think you answered this one, but we'll just go over it again real quickly. To clarify, the requested grant amount can be used for one particular aspect of our programming budget. Yes. Um, you mentioned our annual programming budget is over $7,000. That's totally fine. It can be used for like to bring in one band at a particular event or something like that, or one activity at a certain larger scale event. That's totally acceptable.
This person has a question about timing. So they say if the public concert's in July and the grant's awarded in the same month, but we have classes for the coming year, would that be acceptable? So I'll answer that just by going over the grant project period again. The grant project period is what we call the time frame within which all of the funded projects have to happen. And for this grant project, this grant program, that is July 1st of 2025 to June 30th of 2026. That means that if you have a concert on July 2nd of 2025, then that's fair game. That's within the grant project period and is eligible. And then also if you have other activities, after that concert, say you have a concert July 5th, and then you have classes with that same artist for the next 3 weeks after that, all of that would be eligible because it's all within that grant project period. You will, for very early engagements, like I said, we'll notify everyone by June 20th. And after that is when we'll start getting everyone's paperwork signed and getting checks out to the grantees. And so if your project starts very close to that July 1 date, it may be within 30 days after that you actually receive your check. And that just has to do with the processing time. But I will say if you receive a grant, the faster you sign your paperwork, the sooner we can send you your funding. So if you have very early engagements, I recommend you, and you receive a grant, I recommend you get your paperwork in as quickly as possible because that speeds the process up for us. But it may be within 30 days on either end of your project start date if your project is very close to the beginning of the period. Otherwise, like if your project is in August or September, you'll get it 30 days before, at least 30 days before. It's just for those really early ones where sometimes the funding timing can be a little trickier. But as far as whether the activities would be eligible, as long as they're within that July to June year, then you're fine. And I hope that makes sense. The timing thing can also be a little confusing. So again, if you have questions about that and how it affects your eligibility, just ask us.
For the virtual event question, do those contributing to the event, the artists, need to be from the Mid-Atlantic region?
No, you can bring in artists from wherever. We've funded projects with artists who traveled internationally for in-person events, and it could be the same for virtual events. Again, you just want to make sure in those traditional art form and project personnel questions that you're really explaining where the artist is coming from, what art form they're presenting, their background, and how that art form connects to the virtual community that you're trying to reach, why it's the right fit for your audience. This says our partner organization has applied for NEA funding for a festival. Could we seek funding for one artist at the festival in addition to whoever they hire with the NEA funding? Yes, absolutely. You just could not use that NEA funding as your match. So let's say you have a really big festival, you're bringing in lots and lots of artists. You could get both NEA funding and Folk and Traditional Arts Community Projects grant funding for the same festival, but you would need to have a match for both of them that came from somewhere else. So you get a $20,000 grant from the NEA, you get a $7,000 grant from us, you need $27,000 from somewhere else for the match. You can't use that money to match themselves because it's all from the NEA.
Yeah, you can't use the match to match both. So
Yeah,
that's where the 27 comes in.
you
It
can't
can't be a
double dip your
triangle, it
match
has
and
to
use it
be a
twice.
square. 4 points. Is there a limit on number of grants given per state? Not really.
No, no, there's
I
not.
will say we strive to make sure that we have at least one project funded in every state. And we try not to just fund, 20 projects in New York. But so maybe really the limit is the amount of money we have to give away, um, which can depend on how the percentage that we fund, which depends on a lot of other things.
Yeah, there's no limit to the number of grants given per state. But the more high scoring grants we get, and the more we have to look at the amount of funding we have and figure out within that whose scores are going to push them above a certain limit. So every year we have strong grants that are very deserving in all of our states that don't get funding because of the amount of money we have available. But just because you're in a certain state, there's not like, we don't have like a ceiling for the number of grants we give per state. We just want to make sure that we have good, broad geographic diversity in terms of who we're funding because we are a regional arts organization and we serve 10 states and jurisdictions. This person says Mid-Atlantic Arts considers street styles like hip hop dance as folk arts, but I don't see many of these organizations being awarded. Would hip hop dance fall in this particular grant category? Absolutely, and we would love to see more applications. We don't get a ton of applications for more contemporary traditional art forms. But we would really love to. We funded voguing before. We have funded hip hop before. We've funded spoken word projects before. That would absolutely fall within folk and traditional arts. And we would love to see more applications.
I believe we've only had one hip hop funded project, so would love
Yeah.
to see more of that. And one of my favorite things is when our occasionally our colleagues will come up to us and be like, is hip hop folklore or something to that effect? And we're like, oh yeah.
Yeah. In terms of public facing component, do students at a public school count? Yes, absolutely. So by public facing, we just mean that it can't live somewhere within your organization and never see the light of day, but it can be public for a specific audience. So the public facing component could be students at a local public school, and that would be just fine. So yes.
Our organization is included in Mid-Atlantic Tour's roster artist list. Does this impact our eligibility?
So I don't think so. I assume this would be for like an artist ensemble that is also incorporated as a nonprofit organization. Because for folk and traditional community projects grants, you have to be a nonprofit organization. But if you are on the roster artist list for Mid Atlantic Tours, which means that you would not be the organization, you would be part of another organization, a presenter's application to Mid Atlantic Tours as the artist. You can still be eligible for folk and traditional community projects grants for an unrelated project, but it couldn't be for the same tour or the same project as your pursuing through Mid Atlantic Tours. But if you're an artist in Mid Atlantic Tours and you're applying as your own organization for folk and traditional community projects for a different project, that would be fine. I really encourage you to reach out and talk to us one on one because that could be a little tricky to figure out. But generally speaking, yes.
The project timeline is from July. I mean, wait, yeah. When is it?
July 1st, 2025 to June 30th,
Thank you.
2026. That is the implementation period, the grant project period.
Let me put that in the chat.
So any funding you got, if you were to receive a grant, you'd have to spend all of your funding within that year, and all of the activities would have to happen within that year. We have about 5 minutes left. We have 3 questions left in the Q&A. I know there may be more in the chat. If we don't get to your question today, please just reach out to us. Come to office hours, shoot us an email, give us a call. It's kind of our favorite thing, talking to applicants. It's like the best part of our job. So don't be shy. This person says, if an event is for the summer after July 1st, but project planning starts in January, is any of the project planning staff time eligible as an organizational match? So not if it happens outside of the grant project period. Everything related to the match and related, as far as Mid-Atlantic Arts is concerned, the project starts July 1, 2025. And so all of the matching funds would have to also be spent within that period. So if you have a project, you have funding that's funding staff time during that project period, that can be part of your match, but not if it happens outside of the project period. That's a good question.
Can organizations submit more than one application for various programs? No. We would suggest that you pick your favorite, pick your best application to submit.
You can only submit one
You
per
can, right.
cycle. Like the system will only let you submit one per cycle. So if you want to talk to us to help like decide which project, we can help
That's always a fun one.
brainstorm with you. Yeah. But ultimately you will have to pick one to pursue. Is the decision making entirely in the hands of the panelists? To what extent at all does Mid-Atlantic Arts have a part in the application selection? That's a really good question. The short answer is yes, decision making is entirely in the hands of the panelists, because they review all the applications and they give them a score. And it's those scores that affect who gets funded. It's always top scoring applications that get funded. What we, the staff, can decide is, or what we have control over, is essentially if we have 1 through 20 who scored very highly, we can decide, are we going to fund the first 10 or the first 15 or all 20 of them? That's where we have some discretion, and that depends entirely on how much funding we have available.
And how
So
far we want to disperse that.
yeah, so let's say we have $100,000 of grants to give out, and that top 20 probably is requesting a total of more than $100,000. They may be requesting $200,000. So that means we could fund half of them at 100%, or we could fund more of them at partial percentages. We know that of getting funding, which means that if you requested $7,000, we would be funding you, but we'd only give you five, for example. And we know that that can be really challenging. It can be hard to execute a project if you're given partial funding. So we do try to avoid giving partial funding or to fund people at least 80%, nothing below 80%, if at all possible. But that's where Joel and I sit down and do some math and do some puzzle pieces to figure out how many of those top scoring applicants we can fund with the money that we have available. But how far down that list we get is like what the actual list is entirely dependent on the panelists and the
scores themselves.
the scores based on the criteria that are in the guidelines.
And just to piggyback off of that, because we have another question that is, does funding favor projects that cross more than one geographic region within the eligible states or projects with multiple partner organizations? Never mind. I thought that was related. That's not really related.
It's kind of related.
Yeah.
That's not a criterion, so that won't affect your likelihood of getting a grant per se. The only things that the panelists score on are those six criteria that are in the guidelines. If you are able, because you have great partners, and so you're able to give a really strong response to the project personnel question because the community collaboration question, for example, because you have really strong partnerships, great. But just because you have multiple partners, that itself would not affect your likelihood of getting a grant. It would be how you answered those questions and how that related to the criteria. And we have one more question. Perfect timing, anonymous attendee. Can you apply for more than one Mid-Atlantic Arts grant? I'm also interested in the Cultural Sustainability Community Roots grant. That's great. I love that you're interested in that too. You can apply you can apply for as many grants as you want. The question comes in whether you can receive more than one, and that depends on the program. So for this particular case, you could receive a Folk and Traditional Arts Community Projects grant and a Cultural Sustainability Community Roots. You could receive both of those. There's no conflict. And that's because cultural sustainability is funded by private funding. This is funded by the NEA. Those funding sources don't conflict. So you can absolutely apply for and receive both of those. Some of our other NEA funded programs, like Mid-Atlantic Tours, Arts Connect, and Special Presenters Initiatives, and also the Central Appalachia Living Traditions Experiences Grant, you cannot receive the same year that you receive community projects. So you could apply for more than one, but you could not receive more than one. And we would not necessarily recommend that you apply for more than one. We'd probably recommend that you decide which program is going to be the best fit for you and focus your energy on that. But for Cultural Sustainability Community Roots, that has no conflict with this program. You can and should apply for both if you're eligible. All right.
Well, that's it, folks.
Well done, everybody. Thank you all for being here. It's lovely to see so many familiar and new friends' names in the chat today. The recording of this webinar will be available on our website and YouTube channel in the next few days.